Welcome to the Commercial Awareness Compass, your weekly guide to developing your commercial awareness in a way that goes beyond just the news. Each week, we're focusing on one major story and we're breaking it down for you in a way that's easy to understand, going through 3 levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. So, whether you're new to commercial awareness or you have that understanding already, our goal here is for you to move up one level each week. We're going to break down today's story in a way that's easy to follow, and we'll give you practical insights to use in your interviews and applications. So, hi, I'm Tori. I'm a future trainee solicitor, and I'm joined by Henry, who is a corporate lawyer and content creator. Today's session, we're talking about a very hot topic that I would imagine many of our viewers have probably heard of, which is the upcoming potential ban on TikTok in the US. So, to our viewers, as we go through the levels, beginner, intermediate, and advanced, I encourage you to really pay attention to how each level builds on the last. So start by understanding the basics and then think about how businesses and industries are impacted. And then in the advanced level, we're thinking strategically long-term. So starting with the beginner level, well, really, let's set the scene first. So Henry, could you explain what we're talking about here, this potential TikTok ban?
Yeah, sure. So the potential TikTok ban is largely going to apply to TikTok in the US. And it stems from concerns that the US government have in terms of national security, in that there are concerns around TikTok's owner, which is a company called ByteDance, who also owns companies like CapCut that some of you may use, or Lemonade, which is another social media platform. Is collecting US individuals' data and then is sending that data to the Chinese government, which the US have concerns that could have data like national security issues and risks, and pose a number of other issues. So the government have effectively, firstly, removed it from all government official devices, and has secondly legislated for the app to be banned. And obviously there are tensions between China and the US already from a political landscape perspective. But I believe it is, depending on when this goes live, Sunday the 19th is when the Supreme Court decision is made in terms of whether or not the government had sort of the legal validity to actually legislate for this ban to come into effect. And of course, if it does come into effect, there are going to be a whole host of issues and points of concerns that organizations are going to be taking, and that us as lawyers and employees of law firms will have to take into consideration, which is all fun and games.
Yeah, so at this beginner level, so you mentioned with this potential ban, there is a whole host of issues that we could see. So I would imagine someone at the beginner level of their commercial awareness could definitely brainstorm some of the ways that this ban could affect people and some of the commercial issues that would arise. So I thought maybe we could do a little bit of that brainstorming right now. What kind of issues do you think could arise from this ban?
So I think one of the biggest risks are, let's start with the people at TikTok, actually. So we've got employees at TikTok in America. What's going to happen to them? What do their employment contracts say? What are the terms around, are they going to be terminated? I think Shou, the CEO, has announced that most of the employees, all of them, will keep their jobs. But what do the contracts say? Are there any provisions around this? So that's one thing to keep in mind. And that's where the employment specialists will help, particularly whoever their legal providers are out in the US. But then if we take it to the UK, for example, a number of companies or law firms here in the UK will be advising companies in the US that partner with TikTok or have a presence on TikTok. So what do those contracts say? Will there be any sort of early terminations? What are the terms around this? Heck, will the force majeure provisions be activated? For those that don't know, force majeure is basically defined as like being an act of God, where something outside of the party's contemplation happens and the contract cannot be performed for whatever reason. We could also see influencers, creators who work with brands seeking legal advice in terms of the deliverables can no longer be posted to the relevant app. Is that brand still going to pay the creator who's created the content? What does the contract say around that? And I think one of the biggest issues is that we're going to see a whole change in the regulatory landscape, particularly from sort of data protection, information sharing perspective, online privacy, and does this set precedent for the future? And will the UK government in turn perhaps adopt a similar approach to what the US has done? So will UK law firms sort of be looking at horizon scanning, seeing what's going on, and advising businesses accordingly?
Okay, thanks so much. That's such a great overview. I'm especially happy that you mentioned employment law because I had not even considered that. And yeah, the way that you explained it, that's such a big thing to think about. I also think this thing with influencers, it's really, I think, great for people who are at a beginner level of their commercial awareness, because that's something easy to understand. To all of our viewers, there's likely influencers who you follow or who you watch their videos that they're in the US. So you can just think about, what are the potential contracts that those influencers might be involved in?
Yeah, and I think to that point, I'm actually doing a campaign at the moment myself with a US-based company. The agency I'm dealing with are in the UK, the US, sorry. I'm in the UK. My management team are in the UK. We're all having these discussions around what do we do? And like the consensus we had was everything is still valid. Let's just post it all before the ban or the potential ban. So these are conversations that are actively happening around this decision. And yeah, the employment law perspective, I think it's very, very easy to think, oh, something is being banned is going to impact external people, third parties, but also this is an organization that's running and it's being switched off in one country. What then happens to the other countries? Do we see ripple effects? And these are all really interesting times that we live in. If you also take a look at the political landscape of the US right now and the sort of the shift in politics, it's a very interesting space, and I think there are a lot of takeaways that UK law firms will be looking at and advising accordingly on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also your explanation as well about the kind of contracts that you're dealing with and the conversations that you're having with your team. I think that illustrates so well that even though this ban is in the US, that it can likely have kind of international relevance as well. That even though you're based in the UK, it's still something that you're thinking about. So we've gone over employment law, contract law, regulatory changes. I think that gives our viewers a good overview of many of like the different areas of law or issues that could arise. So I thought maybe we could move into the intermediate now and talk about some things that maybe wouldn't immediately come to mind. I would, for example, maybe data privacy, data protection. I think that seems to be quite relevant to this.
Yeah, Tori, I would completely agree that data sharing, data protection, online privacy is to an extent at the heart of the reasoning behind why the US is pushing for this ban. So if it does come into effect, whilst it primarily affects US data potentially just being shared with China, allegedly, that's going to have a ripple effect in terms of how UK-based companies look at their data sharing arrangements and whether or not we need to be advising UK companies on reviewing their data sharing processes. Are we sharing data with China? Are we sharing data with the US? What does that look like? Obviously, we've got the Data Protection Act, we've got sort of the Privacy Shield for data sharing with the US. But is that going to affect how businesses look at the data that they share? And also, on the flip side of that, are individual users going to be more mindful of data that they give and that they share? Because ultimately, when you get access to something for free that a business provides, your data is largely what's paying for that service for you to access for free. So that's, again, something that firms will be advising sort of clients on, whether that's a client based here in the UK or firms advising a company overseas. I think data is a hot topic, and having the disparity in terms of the regulatory remit around data, if you've got a company that you're advising that operates in, let's just say they operate in the UK, China, and the US, We've got 3 different regulatory remits that clients are going to need to be advised on accordingly. And we're going to see that data is going to be one of the biggest sort of growth points in, I guess, the legal space in terms of what we're advising on, because it's at the root of so many things. We've got TikTok, for example, social media, but then if we take AI and the data that harvests and how it harvests it, that again is another big thing that needs to be taken into consideration. So yeah, you're completely right that data is a huge thing that we're all going to be looking at from this ruling for sure.
And I think this is a hybrid beginner/intermediate question that's maybe just revealing my lack of understanding. But I was wondering, so the data issues are huge here. So I was wondering, what would the involvement of a law firm be related to data issues? Specifically, my question is really about what kind of departments at the law firm would be the ones that are providing that kind of advice?
Yeah, sure. So I think it would be, if we take just a traditional firm, for example, I think it would be a faceted approach in terms of different departments. You'll have a lot of firms will be structured differently, but for the most part, they all have a specific tech team. They all have a data protection focused team, and they'll probably have a litigation team as well that also focus on the data side of things for when things become contentious. So it will be and probably some commercial bods as well, just general commercial guys, just reviewing what's going on, having a look, analyzing what data is being processed, how it's being processed, what the landscape is looking like. So we've got this upcoming decision being made. Once that decision is made by the Supreme Court, we're going to see a whole host of commentary around the outcome, whatever that is, around are we then going to see a shift in terms of how apps and platforms can access data? It will be for those teams within the law firms to be reviewing all of that and advising their sort of tech clients, their digital clients, to say this has happened there, this might happen here, you operate in that jurisdiction, these are things that you need to consider as a result of this decision being made.
Okay, thank you. And this is moving away from the data questions. I thought something that we hadn't talked about yet is about the kind of businesses' concerns related to how they use TikTok. If, for example, they use TikTok for marketing, how this might affect them.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest things that a lot of junior lawyers are pushed to do, or told to consider, or those looking to start law careers or a career in law, is to build a personal brand. And one way to build a personal brand is to use platforms like LinkedIn, TikTok, social media. So many employers have also realized that there is a great benefit in having a presence on platforms like TikTok. If you take a look at Osborne Clark, Hogan Lovells, CMS, whatever they've renamed as, let's just call them CMS because it's easier to say. So many firms now have a social presence, particularly on TikTok, where they get graduate recruitment, current trainees, future trainees to talk about their experiences, to showcase sort of work culture, diversity, what the office is like. So particularly if you take a lot of the American firms as well, TikTok is huge there. So to have that taken away, it's going to make it more difficult to access future talent, particularly with a lot of talent being Gen Z, which have a huge presence on TikTok, and also sort of Gen Alpha, who are slowly starting to enter the workplace, looking at sort of work experience and stuff. So these organizations will need to consider alternative ways to recruit, attract, and ultimately retain future talent. And there's a lot of marketing spend that these firms spend on access to these platforms. So that will need to be reconsidered off the back of any decision being made, because ultimately what happens in the US is going to affect other jurisdictions. It's going to affect firms here in the UK for sure.
Thanks so much for outlining that. I think it's really helpful to see how, so for example, this issue about using TikTok to attract talent for recruitment efforts, I hadn't thought of that. So I think this whole example of this TikTok ban, I think will be really useful to our viewers, because I think there's just, so many things that you can think of where this would be relevant to commercial considerations. Was there anything you wanted to add on this intermediate level before we move on to advanced?
I was just going to say, I equally think it's so, as you mentioned rightly, that there are so many different elements to this as well. And I think for those going into sort of interviews, for example, or sharing stories on or examples even on application forms, there's a whole host of issues that come out of this one topic, but then you can take it from a wider level on a sort of the impacts of the political side of things, and where we see things going. We spoke about this on one of the previous episodes in terms of Donald Trump becoming president of the US, and the impact of that as well. Coupled with this, there's a whole sort of landscape of points to discuss and talk about. So there are so many examples that future talent can use within their applications and interviews, which I think is great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's lots of opportunity with this example to really impress. So if we move into the advanced level, something I was thinking about was, you mentioned at the beginning that one of the areas of law that is engaged here is regulatory, and there's the potential that there's future changes of a similar nature that could happen. I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that, if there's any potential trends that we might see.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to say, oh, it's just an app, it's insignificant if it's banned, who cares? But I think that couldn't be more further from the truth, in a sense that this app being banned because of data security concerns is going to have a monumental effect. It's going to have a huge impact, and is likely going to see a ripple sort of across the globe. It's largely what the US does, the UK may follow. And again, it will be for the firms to be keeping an eye on that. I recall, I can't remember if it was TikTok, but it was some tech-related thing where the US banned it from government officials, offices, all of that. And then the UK carried out a similar, I think it might have been Huawei actually, a similar sort of process and review of those technologies. So it's highly likely that the UK will do something similar in terms of reviewing it and consider whether or not we want to be banning this, because maybe UK data is also being given to the Chinese government. And that's something that will need to be considered alongside any other kind of regulatory changes that happen off the back of this sort of social policy around social media use, data sharing, and just a whole host of things, internet security, that firms will likely have to be keeping an eye on to advise clients on that. Those clients in the tech sector, the startup sector, AI, anything that sort of involves data and internet connectivity, to some extent will be impacted by this and the future change in the landscape.
I was wondering, and this might be too speculative of a question for you to like really be able to answer. I don't really know. But I was wondering if there is the potential for similar decisions to be made in the future. Do you think that law firms, is their role advising their client, in advance of that, is their role advising their client of what kind of processes or policies should be in place in case that happens? Or is the law firm's role more so the ban is on the horizon and then we're talking to clients about it?
No, I think that we know this is coming up, and we know the reasons why. It's around data sharing. So of course, as we spoke about, there will be commentary around what business should be doing after the decision is made, as a result of the decision. But I think, and firms are always horizon scanning. They have dedicated teams, a lot of them, to kind of see what's coming up, produce articles, advise clients accordingly. But in preparation for any such decision and any potential similar behavior or happenings of events here in the UK, firms should be advising their clients, their organizations, to be reviewing their data policy, data privacy, data sharing agreements, checking how data is being used, where is their data being sent, actually do an audit to find out what third parties have access to our customers' data, why do they have that? And I think clients should be doing that regularly anyway. But like a lot of things, these don't always happen for whatever reason, but firms should be advising clients to actually scrutinize these points. And whether that's an app like TikTok, where is that data going? Or if you're a smaller sort of tech startup, just carry out that due diligence, carry out that audit, because it's easier then to prepare for sort of future sort of decisions or policy changes off the back of that. You've got that already there to go, so you're already a foot forwards, and that's our role as lawyers, to be advising clients when things go wrong because they come to us, hello, we need help, this has happened. Or we should be advising them as well in advance of things happening to say, have you thought of this? Have you seen this in the news? This is coming up. This could affect you in X, Y, and Z ways. Why don't we consider this? Or here are some options for you, and present those options to the client so they can say, okay, we'll do this. Or actually, let's wait for the ban to come into effect and see if the UK carries out something similar before spending time, resource, and money on carrying out that audit. But we've told the client, and that's what we should be doing. It's then for the client to decide whether or not they actually want to do it.
Mm-hmm. And so we've come back to the data protection issues, which I think is really great that we're back to that, because I think that also does link to this advanced level 2. If we're taking this big picture view, thinking strategically, thinking about trends. So I also wanted to come back to something you said earlier, where you said there could be a trend as well of where individuals are thinking more about their data as well. Do we see that trend being relevant to law firms too, where individuals have more of these concerns?
I feel like that's potentially out of the scope of, say, a traditional corporate commercial law firm in a sense, but I caveat that on the basis that if, say, for example, there's like a mass action, then perhaps it would be quite interesting to see if something comes off the back of the potential TikTok ban, if we suddenly get a whole class action of US citizens bringing a claim against TikTok for sharing their data to China, with China, the Chinese government. But obviously, of course, you have to prove that that's actually happened, and you have to go through that whole process. And I think that's something that sort of the larger corporate commercial clients would be doing. If, say, for example, I or you are concerned around our data and our data sharing and where that's gone, we as an individual don't really have the time or the sort of the financial resource to bring a claim. I don't, you may do, to bring a claim against like TikTok or Meta for sort of using my data inappropriately. So yeah, I think it's something to consider, but I don't think it's going to be something huge for law firms right now, or if at all, unless it becomes a huge class action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really, really useful to clarify as well, because I think to all of our viewers, it is really important that you're thinking about what it is that the law firm actually does, what are the kinds of services that it actually provides, and then how the issue would be relevant then. So I guess the final thing I wanted to talk about, because when you mentioned class action or potential class action suits, I then thought we could talk about litigation, if there's any litigation issues that we see as well.
I think the biggest thing would be to, I see it from the perspective of sort of contracts that clients may have with TikTok or other third parties, and whether or not, I'm sure the ban wasn't necessarily considered at the time these contracts were put together. But there would be provisions for like force majeure, and it would be advisable to clients to review the termination provisions within the contract, what constitutes sort of a material breach of the contract. For a lot of you who may not have sort of reviewed a contract in detail, if at all, usually when you have a material breach, right or provision within a contract, what that does is it sets out a list of events that on the occurrence of one of these events happening, the contract can be terminated immediately without notice. And usually in that same contract, you will have a provision that says X party, Y party can terminate the contract on, let's say, 60 days notice as the general rule. But if a material breach provision happens, you can forego that termination period and you can just effectively terminate it as soon as you say there's been a material breach, we're terminating right now. So to review the contracts to see what these provisions say, does this constitute a material breach? Do we carry on as normal? Go through the provisions and just see what the implications are would be like the top tip.
Yeah, and that just gave me one more question where I was thinking about. So you mentioned there could be this list of certain events where termination of the contract would be available immediately. But what is likely to be the issue here is that many companies will not have had the ban in their thoughts when they were drafting the contracts. So do you think it's possible now that contracts will be drafted differently with the contemplation of a potential ban as well in mind?
Do you know what immediately springs to mind is COVID? And when we hit COVID, a lot of contracts, particularly in the public sector, didn't factor in COVID in their like force majeure provisions because nobody was expecting a pandemic or an epidemic, whatever how it was defined. But now, if you look at a lot of force majeure provisions post-COVID, you will see the wording in there that explicitly carves out or mentions a pandemic and the implications around that. Whatever the rest of the force majeure clause says, within the scope of the events, it will include a pandemic. So I think in the drafting, people will be more mindful of this when they're engaging into contracts with social media platforms or sort of around that sort of space, the tech space, the internet space. Because I think if we see one app be banned because of sort of security concerns, it won't be long until we see sort of similar things happen to other sort of similar providers, vendors, social media platforms, tech spaces, whatever you want to call them. So I think we will see a shift in drafting. But again,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say we saw this with COVID. We'll see this with this. We'll see with other events. It's just being mindful of making sure like the drafting is either as broad as it needs to be. But of course, you can't foresee a lot of these things happening at the time of drafting. So it's kind of a balancing act for us as lawyers to make sure that we're making the drafting wide enough to capture as many sort of events, but also it still needs to be reasonable because you can't just put alien invasion because arguably that could happen in say 1,000 years, but at the time of drafting, realistically not going to happen, is it?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the COVID example as well, because I think that illustrates really well how the law, we kind of learn as we go to some extent. When issues like this occur, lawyers are learning so much about how to provide better services to their clients always. So I think it's really, really cool to think about. Was there anything you wanted to add on this advanced level before we conclude?
No, I was just going to say the point that you just mentioned then, Ari, the constant always learning, that is effectively what this job is, that things are always happening, new things are popping up with clients all the time, things come out of the blue, like a ban of your social media app. So it's always just being alert to that and thinking, what does this actually mean for my client? You can say this has happened, but then are you asking, so what? So what does that mean? And that's where clients get real value, is when you say, this has happened, so this means this, and actually giving that extra layer of context that they can apply to their business. Yeah,
thanks so much. I think that's an awesome note to conclude on, that this job is constant learning. And I think for our viewers who are preparing for upcoming interviews, you're just kind of starting that process now of learning this commercial awareness. So thank you for joining today's session. I hope that it was useful for you. Please remember, of course, as always, commercial awareness, it's more than just staying on top of the news. It really is going beyond that. It's about knowing what's going on and then asking these questions about why businesses care, why law firms care, what the kind of involvement of a law firm would be. So thank you so much, Henry, for your useful insights. And thank you again to our viewers for joining. Join us next week to keep building your commercial awareness. And until then, prepare without the panic.